Following video is part of my practical TypeScript course. And if you wish to enroll in the full course, please navigate to codingaddict.io. Again, the URL is codingaddict.io, or you can utilize the link provided in description. All right, and up next, let's see how I can fetch data in React with TypeScript. And we'll actually look at two options, the good old use effect and fetch API, and my current favorite one, the React query with Axios. Please keep in mind that this section will only make sense if you watch the fetch data fundamentals part, since I'm not going to repeat things like Zod setup and the actual need for types. Just like in the previous examples, we're going to start in the app TSX, where we're looking for component and more specifically the star and then 08 fetch data. And then if we take a look at the browser, this is what we should see. We'll also use the same URL like in fundamentals. So basically we'll fetch the same tours from my server. And therefore I suggest just navigating to README. You're looking for 08 fetch data and just grab these two lines of code. So we'll utilize these hooks in a second. And then also here's the URL we're going to use. So grab it over here. Then we're going to navigate back. And I guess let's just start setting up these state values. Now, eventually we'll set up the tours, but at the end of this video, I'll show you why we're not doing that right now. Why essentially we need a type first. And then let's set up two more state values. We're going to have one for is loading and then also set is loading. So this is going to be true while we're fetching. We're going to go with use state, and we can provide angle brackets here. It's definitely an option, or we can just type over here the default value, and then TypeScript is going to be super smart and is going to figure out that essentially this will be a Boolean. So I guess let's just go with that one. And as far as my default value, it will be set equal to false. Then we also want to go with is error, and we're going to set it to set is error. So that will be our set function. And here we're going to provide the angle brackets, and there's going to be a union type. So either it's going to be a string. So if there's error, I'm actually going to use the error message, or it will be null. And null will be my default value. So I'll just provide null over here. Then the good old use effect, and we want to set up the fetch function inside of it. So let's go with our use effect. Let's provide the callback function. We're just going to invoke it when the component mounts. And inside of it, let's set up our fetch data, which will be my async function. So fetch data, and let's set it equal to async. And as far as the functionality, since it's async, we want to nicely wrap everything in the try and catch. And also we want to start by setting is loading is true. So while we're fetching, we'll set it equal to true. And then at the end, we'll set it essentially equal to false. And you know what? Actually in here, let's go with finally. So in here, we'll just set it, set is loading and equal to false. So whether we're getting the error or we're successful, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we'll always set it back to false. Now in the try block, this is where we want to construct our fetch, which again, we can right away start using because we have access to it. So we're going to go here with await fetch. Then we provide the URL. Then fetch API has that quirk where effectively we do want to catch the 404 errors as well. So I'm just going to check for that OK property. So if I have some kind of error, I actually want to throw it over here. So throw new error, which of course will right away lead to a catch block. And then as far as the message, I'm just going to say failed to fetch tours. And after this condition, I want to set up my raw data, since eventually we'll set up Zod as well. And for now, let's just go with response.json. And then let's log this data. So we're not going to set anything in the state. And when it comes to a catch, let's again construct that message. So we're going to go with message. And this one is equal to error. And we're going to check whether error is the instance of an error. And if that's the case, then we're going to go with error and message, or there was an error, so something generic. And we also want to go here with set is error, and we want to provide our message. So that should do it. We just want to invoke it over here. And we want to set up 3 returns. So at the moment we have 1. So basically this is our standard return. And now let's check for loading. Let's check for is error. And then let's see whether we actually are getting data. And then we'll discuss why we want to set up the tours in the following video. So let's start over here. We're going to go with if and then is loading. Okay, good. And then we're going to go with heading 3, loading, and then dot, dot, dot. Okay, good. Then we also want to do the same thing pretty much for error. So now we're checking for this value, and we're going to go with error, and actually we can display the message as well, just in case there is any. So I'm going to go with error, and let's access the error message. Is error. And then I'll just leave this one for now. So eventually we'll iterate over the doors. So now let me navigate to the browser. Again, if everything is correct, we should see those doors, and I can see the array of 5 doors. So that works. We should also have that loading for a split second. And let's say if we're going to mess with the URL, if I'm going to provide the wrong URL, notice now I have actually error, failed to fetch doors. And now again, let's reiterate, why do we need a type? So let's try to set up doors state value. At the moment, we don't have the type, so essentially we'll just provide empty array. Then let's try to set it over here in the fetch data, and then let's iterate over and see where the issue is going to be. So for starters, we want to go over here with const doors set doors. Okay, beautiful. Then we want to go with use state, and remember, if we're just going to provide over here empty array, which will be default value, notice now doors is actually set equal to a never, which means that, yeah, I can go over here and I can go with set doors. I can provide raw data. Okay, beautiful. Everything is awesome. And then let's say right after the React TypeScript, we're going to go with doors, then map. So we're iterating over. And then as far as the function, well, let's access the door, correct? Okay, good. And then we're going to go with some kind of heading 2. We provide hello. We can even see those hellos in the browser. Okay, beautiful. But what if we're going to try something like this? Let's say I want to access one of the properties. I'm going to go with the name one. So now if we go here and say tour and that dot name, this is not going to fly. TypeScript is going to say, well, you cannot access the name property on type never. And this is why we do, again, need to set up the type. And in our case, since we already know how to work with Zod, and since we're going to use Zod to evaluate our data at runtime anyway, this is going to be our approach. Okay, so now let's set up our type, and we'll do that with the help of Zod library, since that way we can also check the data at runtime. And this is totally up to you. You can set up the file name utils.ts or something along those lines. I think in my case, I'm just going to go with types. Now, as a side note, also in this file, we will set up a fetch function with the Axio. So that is coming up. So basically, we'll just jam a bunch of the things. Normally, in the bigger project, you would separate them, but I don't think there is any need. So we're looking for Zod library, which again is already installed. If you're using the starter, if not, then just please install the library. Then let's construct that door schema, which will also then infer to be our tour. So let's export that since we also want to use that one in the index. So we'll go with export, then const door, and then we're looking for schema over here. So this one will be equal to z.object. So this is what we're constructing. And I believe I had 5 properties in there. So all of them were string. That's for sure. So we're going to go over here. Then let's copy and paste. And I believe it's one too many, by the way. So let me remove this one. And then we have one for name. Also, we want to set up over here image. Then same deal, info. And at the very end, we'll have the price one. I'm missing a commas. So let me do that as well. And now let's construct our type. This is something also we're going to export. So let's go here with export type and then Tor, and that is equal to z infer. So now we just infer the type, which is a generic, and we're just going to go with type of and then Tor schema. So now we have both. We have our schema and we also have our type. So now let's navigate back over here and we want to import both of those things. We want to grab the Tor as well as the Tor schema. So let me set it up. I think I'm going to type over here type Tor just to make it more explicit what we're doing. So we want to grab the schema as well. And then this one is coming from the types. Let's save this. And now let's just start using the type. And I guess right away also the Tor schema. So here, where I have the use state for Tors, I actually want to go with Tor and the array. So essentially, I'm telling TypeScript that, yeah, this is an array, but eventually it will be an array of Tors. Then we're going to keep on moving. And where we have the raw data, same deal. I'm going to go with Tor and I'll set it as an array. Then we actually want to run right now our Tor schema. Remember, there is an array method. And again, I want to save parse it. So essentially, I want to throw the error myself, and it's going to be nicely caught over here. So for now, I think I can remove both of these ones over here. We won't use them. And essentially, we want to get that result. So let's go to the result. Then Tor schema array. Let's invoke this. And then we're going to go with save parse, and we're looking for raw data. And then as far as the result, remember, we're checking for the success property. And essentially, if the data is not present, then we're just going to throw the error. So we're going to go with if and result success. If that's not the case, then, I mean, you know what? We can actually log it. So let's go with the result, error, and message over here. And also, we want to throw our own error. So let's go with throw new error. And again, let's do the same thing. We'll go with failed to parse and Tors. And then at the very, very end, we want to go here with set Tors and we want to pass in result.data. So if we're successful, if we bypass this condition, pretty much we're good to go. And I think at this point, essentially, we can just navigate to our return and we can just set up the proper return. So in here, let's go with the heading 2. I'm going to add some class. So I'm going to go with margin bottom and set it equal to 1. Then we're going to go here with Tors. Okay. And then let's iterate over. So we have Tors over here. We want to call the map. And now once I type the Tor, it will nicely be my object. Everything starting with ID all the way to a price. And again, this is something that doesn't stop to amaze me. So we're going to go here with return. Then we want to set up the paragraph. Again, we're not going to really work on amazing result in the browser for now. We just want to grab the Tor ID. We want to add some classes over here. So class name, and let's go with another margin bottom 1. And then let's access the Tor dot, and we're looking for the name. And again, if everything is correct, this is what we should see in the browser. Yep, everything is awesome. And if we go over here to the types, and let's say I'm going to add a property. I'm going to say that I'm looking for something, and that will be a string, and let's invoke that. Check it out. First, I have over here a error message in the console, and we can also see that over here. Now, $1 million question, do you always need to add Zod when you're fetching data? And honestly, most likely that's not something that you're going to see that often. For the most part, you're just going to rely on the fact that, yeah, the API is supposed to return some kind of type. But it does come in handy when you definitely want to check for that particular value. So this is how we can essentially fetch with React and TypeScript with the good old use effect and fetch API. And now let's see how we can accomplish the same thing with less lines of code and essentially no headache. And we're going to do that with the help of Axios and React Query. And if you're not familiar with either of these libraries, please utilize the library docs or some other online resource, since our main focus is going to be on TypeScript. And I actually want to start by constructing fetch tours with Axios. Again, normally you would set this up in a separate file, but in this case, I'm just going to do it right here in the types where I want to install, or you know what, actually, it's already available in the starter. We simply want to import the Axios from Axios library, which is an awesome HTTP library. And effectively, we want to construct right now the fetch tours. And you know what? I also want to grab right away this URL, and I'll actually remove it from this file since we'll set up use query over here. As a side note, as always, you can find the code from previous lessons in the README. So let me go over here. This is going to be my URL. And essentially, we want to go with export const fetch tours. It will be async. And as far as what we're returning, since it's a async function, we want to go with promise. And then we'll set up our tour array. And then when it comes to functionality, we want to use Axios, and we want to stick await in front of it. So let's go with const response, and that is equal to await. Then Axios.get. Remember, this is actually a generic, and therefore in here we pass in tour and array. So an array of tours, and effectively in this response inside of the data property, we'll get back our array, but it will be nicely already set as type array of tours. Hopefully that is clear. And we actually did cover that during the tutorial part. Now let me double check over here. It looks like I have a syntax bug. Yep, now everything's correct. So we have response, beautiful. Then we'll do the same thing like in the previous video, where essentially I just want to check using Zod. And since it's pretty much the same code, let me again just take it out and set it up over here. So we still use the result or schema. In this case, we're not passing in raw data. We actually go with response.data. Again, that's where the array is going to be located. And then from this function, we want to return. And we're looking for result.data. So since we have multiple libraries, yes, we're pretty much passing this array from one to another. So first we use Axios, and again, just to demonstrate that, basically, if we go over here with type definition, you'll notice somewhere here, get, see over here, it's a generic, and essentially it has this Axios response. And then if you take a look at the Axios response one, notice this data, it's a generic type, correct? So whatever we pass in, this is what we're going to get back. And once we have this function in place, now let's navigate, I guess, actually to the main DSX, because we want to wrap everything in the query client provider. So we want to install React Query library. You can also install DevTools. They have awesome DevTools, but in this case, we're not going to do that. And in here, we want to import the query client as well as query client provider. First, we want to set up a new instance like so. And as a side note, something I want to mention, React Query is actually very good at inferring the types. So as far as TypeScript is concerned, we actually don't need to do much. As long as we set up a proper return type here in the function, basically what we are returning, pretty much we're good to go. So in here, we want to go with new query client. Let's invoke this. And then we want to wrap our app inside of the render. So let me set up my query client provider. We're looking for client. That's the prop. And we'll set it equal to a query client. Then let's wrap the app. And now let's navigate to index DSX. And like I said, I'll pretty much start everything from scratch. And if you want the code from the previous lesson, please just utilize the README. In here, we're looking for fetch stores, a function we just set up. It's actually located in the types, okay? And we also want to grab this hook, which we get from React Query, called use query. Again, this is coming from, and in this case, we have this stand stack and React Query. So we have both of these imports. Now let's set up our component. And let's also set up the export, since I know that I'm going to forget to do that. Let's export the component as default. And for starters, let's invoke use query. So we're going to get a bunch of the things back, and we want to set it equal to use query. So notice we don't need to set up our loading error or any of that stuff. And I'm not even talking about the use effect. Essentially, we just invoke the use query, and we're good to go. It's looking for two things. It's looking for a query key, since we'll nicely be able to invalidate those queries later. Something we're not going to do, but just telling you, it is an option. So essentially, you just provide some kind of string over here. So now this query, we will reference with the name of Tors, just in case we ever want to do something with the query, like, for example, invalidate. And also, we want to set up a query function. Now, this query function has one rule and one rule only. It needs to return a promise. That's it. That's all we need to do. Now, if we navigate to types, what is this function doing? It's async. What does that return? It returns a promise. And like I said, React Query is awesome at inferring the type. So if we set up properly over here that I'm going to be returning an array of doors, React Query is going to figure that out. So in here, since I'm not passing anything in fetch doors, any kind of argument, I simply can set up the reference. Now, what are we getting back over here? We get back is pending. So this is while we're loading. We get back is error, if there is any. We also get the actual error object, just in case we want to get the message. And just like Axios, in here we have this data one. And inside of that data, we'll have that array of doors. Now, since I want to use pretty much the same name, I'm just going to give it an alias of doors. Okay, good. And with this in place, now let's set up our return. So one by one. First, we're going to go with is pending. So check that one. If that's the case, again, same deal. We're going to go with heading 2 or heading 3, and we'll go with loading. Then we're going to go with is error. So if we have the error, actually, I do want to access the error message. So let's go here with error, and we'll set it equal to error object. And in there we have a message property. And now let's iterate over the doors. Same deal. Essentially, we just want to showcase the tour name in some kind of paragraph. So let me set up the return. We're looking for div. Inside of the div, we're going to go with heading 2. Let's add a class name. Margin bottom, set it equal to 1. That will be equal to tours. And then we want to iterate over. So let's call map. Then each and every tour. Okay, good. And then we want to return from the function. And I'm going to go with my paragraph. Let's add a class name of margin bottom 1. And also let's add a key. And we'll set it equal to tour and then ID. And then inside of it, let's render the tour.name. And if everything is correct, again, the result is going to be the same. But like I said, way less headache, way less state values, and pretty much everything is already inferred. So we only need to set up a use query. We only need to set up fetch doors, and pretty much we're good to go. Okay. Now let's cover Redux toolkit setup, which is a good option if you have a global state. As a side note, if you're not a fan of Redux toolkit, a nifty alternative is a library called ZooStand. I believe that's how it's pronounced, which offers pretty much the same functionality, but with less overhead. And the code is also less clunky, I have to admit. But since at least at this point in time, you'll encounter Redux toolkit more often, I settled on RTK. As far as TypeScript, Redux Toolkit, just like React Query, also nicely infers a bunch of the things. So it's actually less work than, for example, use reducer. But I'm not going to lie. The setup, so the initial setup to add Redux Toolkit to our application with TypeScript is somewhat of a pain. Now, the good news, it's a boilerplate setup, so we can take it from project to project. So most likely, you'll only need to write it once. And in fact, we will do a setup in the following video. So for now, we'll just prepare everything. We'll actually create our first slice. And then in the following video, we'll complete the boilerplate setup. For starters, we want to go to app DSX. We're looking for starter, RTK, the component. If everything is correct, this is what we should see on the screen. And since we're shooting for the same functionality as in use reducer, I suggest navigating to README and just grab this code. So again, this is just going to set up some buttons, which we'll use later to control our state values. So grab everything in here. As far as the component is concerned, you want to navigate back over here, paste it, and again, you should have 5 buttons, and pretty much every time you click on a button, there's going to be some kind of console log. And then we want to set up a slice. Now, slice in Redux Toolkit essentially is just a piece of functionality. So let's say in your application, you're handling the user. So the logout, login, whatever, all kinds of things. Well, you'll set that one up in a slice. Let's say you have a theme. You'll create a slice for that. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Now, in our case, we'll just dump everything in one. So I'll say counter slice. And we're looking for TS since we're not creating a React component. Then we want to import 2 things. So create slice is going to create that slice for us. It's a function coming from Redux Toolkit. And second one will be payload action, which actually is a type. And this is something we're going to use towards the end of the video. So now let's go with create and slice. Okay, that's what we want to import over here. Good. Then let's also grab that payload, but this is actually a type. So payload action, and yep, it's coming from Redux Toolkit. Beautiful. Now we will set up some types in a second. Let's start by creating that slice. So counter slice, and this will be equal to create slice. And second, we'll provide some values. Before I forget, I do right away want to export. And actually, we export the reducer function. So we go here with default counter slice and then dot reducer. So this is something we're going to use when we set up the store. So think of store as pretty much your entire state. And then the slice, well, this will be that one functionality. Again, in our case, pretty much that will be the only functionality, but in bigger applications, this is where you'll set this one thing. And as far as the create slice, it's looking for a few things. It needs to have the initial state. And we'll also right away set up those reducers. So you know what? Let's just start setting everything up. If you remember, when it comes to the state, we have count and status over there. And then it will be our initial state. And this is something that we're going to provide over here in the create slice. So let's start here. Const initial state. For now, I'm not going to set the type. I'm just going to say that count is equal to 0, and then status will be pending. And remember, we'll just control it from active to inactive, I believe. Then inside of the create slice, we want to come up with a name. And essentially, I'm going to call this counter. And then also we want to go with our initial state. In a second, we'll set up the reducers, which control it. But before we do that, well, why don't we just knock out those types over here? So first, let's set up a type for the counter state. So type counter and state. And in here, count will be equal to a number. And then when it comes to status, I'll actually set up the literal type because we'll use it later to provide a proper type to payload action. So we might as well set it up separately. So let's set up a status, but instead of setting up as a string, I'll actually create another type. I'll call this counter status. So this is essentially something we control when we add that payload over here. Now, when it comes to a counter, we'll press these buttons over here without the payload. And as far as the literal values, well, we're going to go over here with active, inactive, and let's also add the pending one. And once I have this one in place, status actually is going to be equal to a counter status. So now where I have the initial state, I'm going to go with my counter state. And then we want to set up those reducers. So reducers are going to be functions which essentially control the state. And then in order to invoke those functions, we'll need to dispatch them. And again, remember when it comes to actual count, the number, the only thing we need is whether we want to increase, decrease, or reset. But when it comes to set status, this is where we actually pass in the payload. Now, the good news with the Redux toolkit, effectively, if we're just controlling this one value, we don't even need to provide the type. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. So we want to go with reducers. It's an object, and then one by one, let's set them up. And pretty much, I just come up with a function name. So for example, in this case, increment. I right away have access to a state. And as a side note, yes, Redux toolkit nicely infers all of the values that we need over here. And then, yes, we can essentially just overwrite. So I can just go with count plus and equals to 1. So notice I don't need to provide my type. Since I'm not providing any payload, that's it. I only want to set up this function over here, and we'll export it in a second, and eventually we will dispatch it. Hopefully that is clear. Then we want to go with decrement, I guess. Let's go with state. Same deal. We want to go with state count, and in this case, we'll subtract. And then when it comes to reset, we just want to access the state. Okay, good. And then set the state count equals to 0. As a side note, if you're wondering why we can just modify the state like that, why don't we need to return state from this function? It's because under the hood, essentially, Redux is using a library which does that for us. So that's why we can actually kind of modify the state directly in here. Under the hood, yeah, we're still getting the latest value. Don't worry. And then we have this set status, which essentially is going to have two things. Not only we'll need access to a state, but this is the case where we will provide the payload. So effectively, when we dispatch set status, we will provide that string value. And the string value is actually one of these ones. So either active, inactive, or it's going to be pending. And when we use a Redux toolkit, we do have this special type which we need to use. So it's called payload. And for some reason, it's not using. So payload action. I'm not sure why I'm not able to access that. So payload action. And it is a generic over here. And then inside of the generic, we want to pass in our own type. So basically, we need to provide over here this counter state. Now I do have over here a syntax error. And now, as you can see, everything works. So if you have the action, yes, you'll need to provide this payload action, which again is a generic. And then in here, you'll provide the type. So in this case, it's somewhat straightforward. We just have a string, but keep in mind, yes, if you have, let's say, an object with a bunch of properties, you'll have to set up the type and provide it over here. So Typescript knows what do you want to do essentially when you pass in that payload. And same deal, we want to go with state.status, and that will be equal to action payload, since that's where we have the string. Now it looks like I have a bug. My apologies. By mistake, I provided the counter state. It should be counter status. My apologies. Now everything's correct. I don't have any bugs. And also, we want to export the increment, decrement all the way to set status. So we won't need to provide in our component, let's say, a type when we dispatch. We simply can pass in our action, and we'll be good to go. So we go here with export const, and then we should have access to all of our functions. So increment, decrement, reset, and then set status, and that one will be equal to counter slice. And then we're looking for actions. This should do it for the slice setup. And in the following video, we'll do that somewhat annoying boilerplate setup where we'll add the Redux toolkit to our application. Okay, and now let's take a look at that boilerplate setup where effectively we want to create two files. We want to create store TS as well as the hooks TS. And as a side note, if you're using the starter, you should have already those files. Now, there shouldn't be any code in them, but you should have the files. And store is where we set up all our slices. So we create that global store, and hooks is a special one because we're using Typescript. And you'll see what we need to do over there in a second. So first, let's start with the store. We want to import configure store. This is coming from Redux Toolkit. And also we want to grab counter reducer. Now this one is coming from our slice, the counter slice. And I need to make sure that it's coming from the starter. So let me go over here with reducer from, and let me look for starter and the RTK. And then I want to get the counter slice. Let me just double check. Yep, I'm exporting. So everything is correct. And then back in the store, we want to invoke configure store. So we want to go here with export const store, since we'll wrap our entire application in the store. And inside of this function, we have a reducer property. And essentially, this is where we set up our slices. So in our case, again, we have only one. So I'm going to go with counter is equal to counter reducer. Since we're using TypeScript, we need to set up two more types. So export type. And again, in the docs, they use this root state. They set it equal to return type. And inside of this one, they go with type of and then store and get state. So this is what they pass into this generic. And the second type we want to set up over here is export type app and dispatch. And this one will be equal to type of and store dispatch. So once we have these two types in place, we want to navigate to the hooks one. And essentially, we want to grab use dispatch and use selector. So those are the two hooks we use with Redux Toolkit. One is to access the store, and the second one is to dispatch an action. And we want to create our own. And you'll see what that entails in a second. So let's first grab use dispatch. Again, this is coming from React Redux. So this is what I was talking about, the annoying boilerplate setup. But again, you only need to realistically do it once. So then import, this is actually a type, and we're looking for typed use selector hook. So this is coming from React Redux. And also we want to grab that root state and app dispatch, the types we just set up. So let's go here with root and state somewhere. Yep, that's the one. And I also want to grab the dispatch. Okay, we have both of these. So now let's set up both of those hooks. So we're looking for export const use. And the name is totally up to you. Just make sure that it starts with use. That's just a rule for React hooks. And in this case, we'll actually go with the function. And we're going to go with app dispatch. And we'll set it equal to use dispatch. So it's going to suggest this use app dispatch. That's not what you want to use. You want to go with use dispatch, which is actually the second one. And then let's also set up the use app selector, which also we're going to export. So we go here with use app selector. And in this case, we just go with type selector hook. We provide the root state or type that we have in a store, and we'll set it equal to use selector here. Let's save it. And now the last step is going to be in the main DSX, where we want to import the entire store from store file, and we want to wrap it in the provider component, which is coming from React Redux library. Now, this provider component is looking for store prop, and as far as the value, we'll pass in our store. So let's go here with provider, then store, set it equal to our store. Then let's wrap it. And with this in place, we have successfully added Redux toolkit to our application. And in the following video, we'll complete the functionality. Okay, so now let's navigate to 09RTK index DSX. And we want to import a few things. First, we'll grab those hooks. So instead of use dispatch and use selector, we're going to go with use app selector. Use app selector, and we also want to grab use app dispatch. And then also let's grab those actions from our slice. So I'm talking about decrement, increment, reset, and set status. So let's grab also this one. This is coming from the counter slice. Okay, good. Then we have increment, then we have reset, and then we also have set status. All of that is coming from the counter slice. Now, in order to access the state values, we want to go with the use app selector. So that's the hook. And essentially by default, it right away has access to the entire state. So I'm talking about this one over here. More specifically, we're looking for the counter. So we're going to go over here and we're going to say state. And as I said, I do need to pass here the function. And then from the state, we want to access the counter. So this will be our tiny slice for the counter. And we can nicely right away the structure two things. What do we have in a state? We have the count as well as the status. So those are the two things that I want to access. So now where I have the count, I'll actually change it around and I'll set it equal to count. And as far as the status, same deal over here. Now, just to keep it more interesting, I'll actually navigate back to my counter slice and let's say set up my initial value to be equal to 15. So now I can clearly see that I have access to the counter as well as my status one. So now we just want to navigate back. And we also want to invoke the use app dispatch, which is going to return a dispatch function we can invoke. So let's go here with const dispatch, set it equal to use app dispatch. And then where we increment, decrement, and reset, we'll just invoke these functions. And then when it comes to set status, remember, we also need to pass in the payload. So it's going to be a little bit more code. So we want to go here with dispatch and we just want to invoke the increment. Same deal is going to be for decrement and reset. So I'm pretty sure I can just copy and paste. So we're looking for decrement over here. And then lastly, we have one for reset as well. So let me override this one. This should do it. Notice now we're actually changing the count value. And when it comes to set status, it's pretty much the same. We just want to actually pass in the string value, whether that's active, inactive, or pending. So let's go here with dispatch, set status. And again, we'll get a nice suggestion. So these are the values that we can pass in. So it's kind of hard to mess up. So let me copy this, set it up over here. And instead of active, we're going to pass in inactive. So now let me navigate quickly to the browser. And it looks like everything is working as expected. And with this in place, we have successfully added Redux toolkit to our application. All right. And up next, let's build a small tasks application. Before we start coding away, let me just mention that if you enjoy the challenge and want to build this project independently, in the README, you will find a list of steps to build such app. So if this is something you're interested in, pause the video, complete the steps independently, and resume once you're ready to compare the results. As far as the app, it's actually very similar to the app we already built at the end of the fundamentals section. Essentially, we will create a form, and a list of tasks. And if the user provides a valid input, we'll add the task to the list. And with the help of the checkbox, user will be able to toggle whether the task is completed or not. Now we'll start just like the other examples where we want to navigate to app DSX and we want to grab our component. So in this case, we're looking for folder number 10, I believe, right? So we're looking for starter, then / and tasks. So let me replace whatever I have in here. Let me set up the component. Yep, I have task list. So that is good. And just like before, since we're working with TypeScript, one of the first things we'll do is to set up a type. And since we'll use this type in multiple files, it definitely makes sense to set up types. Yes. And in this case, there's going to be only one type, which will be a task. So we want to go with export type task. And in here, we have 3 properties: ID, which will be actually a string, then a description, which will also be a string, and then is completed, which will be a Boolean. Let's set it up. And then we want to create 2 more components, which we will render in the index DSX. So we have a form component. We set it up. And also there's going to be a list one, new file, and we're looking for a list. And then we want to create our component. And with this in place, now we want to navigate back to index and we want to import use effect use state, as well as form and list, and also the type. So one by one, let's set it up. So use state, then let's also grab use effect, and then let's grab the form one, list one, and at the very end, let's also grab that type. So import explicitly, I'm going to type task, and then this is coming from the types. Now, inside of this component, essentially, we want to start by setting up the state value. So in here, let's go with tasks, set tasks, and this one will be equal to use state. Let's invoke this one, and by default, it's going to be an empty array, but we do want to provide the generic over here, and we'll say that it's going to be an array of tasks. And when it comes to our return, I think I'm going to replace the div with a section. And in here, let's type the form component first. And we also want to display the list. Let's save it over here. Now, for some reason, I don't see anything. Looks like there's a bug. So it complains that form doesn't provide the import. This is strange. Oh, yeah, probably because I didn't save it. My bad. Let me try one more time. If everything is correct, this is what we should see in a browser. And with this in place, now we can start working on the form functionality. Okay, and when it comes to form, essentially we want to set up the form element. Inside of it, there's going to be an input, and it's going to be a controlled input. So there will be a state value as well. And once we submit the form, we want to prevent the default. We want to check whether there's a value provided in the input. If not, then we will trigger the alert. And if everything is correct, we'll add task to the list, something that's coming up. And also we'll set text back to empty value. I guess I'm going to start by setting up 2 imports over here. So we're looking for use state. And also we want to grab that type because eventually we will use it, not for now. So let's go with type and task, which is coming from our types. And then let's start, I guess, by setting up that state value. So we have text and set text. And that one is equal to use state. And we want to start with empty string. Eventually, we'll set up the handle submit. For now, I just want to work on the return. So we're going to return a form element. We'll add some classes just so it looks a bit more representable. And we're going to go with task form. So again, on submit is coming up. Let's not worry about it right now. Inside of the form, we want to go with input. Type will be equal to a text. Class name, is going to be form input. And also we want to set up the value since this will be a controlled input. And let's also set up the onChange. I'm going to provide the inline function since I don't want to bother with the event type. And we're just going to go with set text and we'll go with event.target and value. Okay, good. And then we also want to set up the submit button. So button, then type is equal to submit, and class name will be equal to a button. And we're going to go with add task. Let's save it. This is what we should see in the browser. So now let's just navigate back and set up that handle submit. So first, let me, I guess, set up the function. This is going to be essentially a repetition pretty much for stuff that we already covered during tutorials. So we're going to go here with handle submit. Remember, we do want to access the event, but we do need to provide the type ourselves in this case. So we're going to go with form event, and we're looking for HTML and form element. This is what we want to pass in. And as far as the functionality, first, we're going to prevent a default. So prevent default, let's invoke that. Then we'll check for text. So if no text provided, then we'll go with alert. And let's just go with please enter a task. Then we're going to return. So we're not going to do anything. And if everything is correct, basically, if we bypass this condition, then we're going to go with add task and we'll go with set text and we'll set it equal to an empty string. So now let's just look for the form. We're looking for on submit and we'll set it equal to handle submit. So let's see. I think we can just log. So instead of adding the task, for now, let's just see what is the text value, whether we are successful. Let me type some nonsense here and looks like everything's correct. So I get the value in the console and I also end up with an empty input. Now, if I'll try to submit without providing any value, then we'll get back the alert. And with this in place, now we can start working on the add task functionality. All right, and up next, let's set up the functionality to add task to the list. Now, we can take multiple approaches. Essentially, we can pass down set tasks to a form. And let's say if the value is provided, we can invoke set tasks. It's definitely an option. But in my case, it's just a preference to set up everything in the parent component. And therefore, I will create another function and I'll call this add task. Now, this function is looking for one thing and one thing only, which is a task. But remember, we have a specific type for that. So we want to go over here with the task. Now, it doesn't return anything, so we can just call here void. And as far as the functionality inside of the function body, we just want to go with set tasks. We want to spread out all the existing tasks. And then we want to add the new one. So we'll go over here with tasks, comma, and then we'll add the task, which was provided to add task. We do want to pass this down. So add task is equal to add task. And if everything is correct, we should get a bunch of red squiggly lines somewhere. In this case, it's in the index DSX, simply because we haven't set up form to accept any props. So let's work on that. We already have the type task. So now let's set up our type here for the props. I'm going to call this form props. And in here, I'm looking for add task function. Same deal. It's looking for this argument, the task one, and it's actually type task. And then when it comes to the return, we're just going to go with void. And then right after our condition, I think I can remove that console log. I don't think there's a point anymore. We can just go with add task and essentially one by one, let's provide those properties. We have ID over here. Remember, it has to be a string. So I'm just going to go with date. Then I'm going to invoke a get time method and eventually I'm just going to turn this into a string. Then I still have a red squiggly line because, I actually haven't set up the props properly. My bad. What am I doing? Let me go here with add task And this is actually going to be equal to a form props. And now we get the correct red squiggly lines, where essentially we can see that few properties are missing. So let's provide them. We're going to go with description. So this one will be equal to a text. And also, let's go with is completed, which we will hard code and set it equal to false. Now I don't have any red squiggly lines. And once we navigate to the browser, I'm actually going to open up the components just so I can see what we have as far as the state. And now let me go with first task. Let me invoke this, and yep, notice over here, we are successfully adding this task to our list. All right, so we're pretty much done with the form. I don't think we're going to work on that component anymore. Now we just want to render the list and also toggle the task. Remember, it has that is completed property, which is Boolean. And just like in the fundamentals project, we just want to display some checkbox, and then every time we will click on that checkbox, then we'll toggle that value. And actually, before we render the list, I do want to right away set up this function since we'll pass it down to a list component. The functionality is super straightforward, where we want to go toggle task. Now this function is looking for the ID. So therefore, let's right away set up the inline type annotation. And let's say that ID is actually going to be type string. Now, as far as the actual functionality, we want to go with set tasks. And then remember, when we invoke map, we get back a new array. So now I just want to iterate over the array. And if the ID matches the task ID, I want to set the task is completed to the opposite value. Now, if it's not the case, if they don't match, then we just return task as it is. So let's go with tasks map. And yes, as a side note, there are a million ways how we can write this functionality. I just went with this approach. So we're going to go here with task. Then we'll check if task ID is equal to ID we're passing in. Then we want to return this task with a new is completed value. So we want to spread out the existing task, and we want to go with is completed and set it equal to the opposite. So we're going to look for task and then is completed. Now, if it's not the case, then we'll simply return the task. And with this in place, now we can pass this toggle task down as well as our entire tasks list. So first prop will be tasks, and the second one actually is going to be toggle task. Now, we haven't set up, of course, anything in the list, so all of that is coming up. Let me just pass this down. We're looking for toggle task. Then let's navigate to our list. And first, let's grab our task. We will need our type. So import type task, and that is coming from my types. Yep, that's the one. And let's set up right away the list props. So type list props. And in here we have tasks, which is actually an array of tasks. And also we want to set up that toggle task. So toggle task, same deal. It's going to have the ID. And actually that ID will be a string. But notice how essentially we're providing an object, correct? So make sure you have the same syntax. Okay, good. And in here, we want to destructure both of them. So tasks and toggle task. And we'll set it equal to list props. Beautiful. And now we want to iterate over the list, display all the items, and also let's right away set up the toggle task functionality. So we're going to go over here with unordered list. Let's add a class name of list. Then inside of the unordered list, let's go with tasks.map. Let's invoke this. And over here, we're going to have a task. And then for every task, we want to set up the return. It's going to be a list item. And also, we'll provide a key. That's a must. So we're going to go here with task ID. Also, let's set up the paragraph. This is where we'll display the task description. As far as the classes, we're looking for task and text. And over here, let's set up task and description. So we have access to that. And now let's set up our input. So at the very end over here, we're going to go with input. Now it's not going to be a text. Actually, we'll go with checkbox. We're going to go with checked. So it has this prop, and we're going to set it equal to task and then dot is completed. So if it's true, then the checkbox is going to be checked. If not, then it's not going to be the case. And we'll right away add this on change. I will pass over here the inline function. We don't need actually the event. I simply want to go with toggle task. And then I want to provide the object with the ID property where I'm looking for task ID. Now, before you ask, can you essentially set up this ID as a straight up argument? So essentially without that object, yes, absolutely. It's just my preference to set it up as an object in this case. And with this in place, we're done with the list as well as toggle task functionality. So if I add a second one, I can nicely toggle over here this value as well. Now, if I'm going to refresh the page, of course, I'm going to lose all of the values since we haven't set up the local storage yet. In fact, this is something we're going to do in the following video. Okay, so now let's just add local storage to our application. And I want to start by navigating to the browser, to the application, and I want to remove the previous ones. I believe I still have values from the fundamental section. Then we want to create two functions. One is going to be load tasks. So we want to load the tasks when the application starts up. And we'll also have one to update the storage. And since it's a React project, we can use useEffect, and then pretty much every time there's going to be some change in a tasks list, we will invoke the update storage. Let's start with the load tasks function. So this function is going to return an array of tasks. As far as the functionality, we want to go with stored tasks. So that is equal to local storage. Then we're looking for get item tasks, something we don't have yet. And then we want to return. And then based on what we have in the local storage, either we're going to return those tasks or we're going to return an empty array. So let's set up turning operator. We're going to go with JSON parse, and we'll pass in stored tasks. If that's not the case, we'll return empty array. And then in here, I'm just going to provide a function, and then I'm going to invoke load tasks. And then, like I said, we also want to set up one to update storage. So every time we'll change something about the list, be it add the task to the list or toggle the is completed, we'll update the storage. So update storage. Now this one is looking for the tasks, and actually it's going to be an array of tasks. Now it's not going to return anything, so we're just going to go with void, and then we want to go with local storage, then dot. We're looking for set item. The name is going to be tasks. And we're going to go with JSON stringify, since we can only store strings over there, and we'll provide the tasks. So this is how we're going to create those items. And then when the project loads, this is how we're going to access them. And like I mentioned, since this is a React project, we can go with useEffect. And then pretty much every time there's going to be some change in our dependency array, which contains the tasks, we will also invoke the update storage, and we'll grab the tasks value. So now let me navigate back to the browser. Notice over here, everything is empty. I have no tasks, but I can go with first task. Okay, good. Second task. Notice how they are actually saved in local storage. I can also toggle the is completed, and then once I refresh, I still preserve the values. That should do it for TypeScript with React section. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. And up next, we're going to start working on a big TypeScript project where we're going to implement most of the things that we have learned in fundamentals, and React with TypeScript sections.